I got another train video for you. Hey, video for you. Hey, Quintinshill. Sorry, I was making sure we were on. Quintinshill train collision. 105 years later. It's gotta be 105 years later. It's called Quintinshill. I ain't never heard of that. That was the video already. Wait, can we get a like? Can we get one like? At least one like. Just one like. That's all I ask. That's all I ask. Not just like a like in a comment section. I'm just like a like in the video overall with the big likes. Big likes. That I need. Let it go further beyond with this channel. You know what I'm saying? Further beyond, like Super Saiyan 3. That further beyond. That really helped me a lot. Okay, let's go. I can tell you just the details that may disturb your viewers. Viewer discretion is advised.
Railroads can play a critical role.
Hey, look, it's a big old tank in the sky.
War. During the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865,
wow, I don't know anybody that was born that year.
The Union Army played a key role in their victory over the Confederate Army in terms of transport for munitions, troops, the wounded, and more. During World War I, this was no different for the European,
oh man, I ran out of chocolate milk.
Including Great Britain.
Those two videos I just did.
Sidings and munition factories
use it all up.
Being set up for the impending Great War throughout the 1910s. At Richburg, Kent, the new port there.
Look at all these people that are probably not living in this world anymore. Not to offend anybody, but hey.
By the second week of the First World War, 14,008 extra trains were running on British railroads.
How many did you say?
14,008 extra trains were running on British railroads, with some arriving.
Why do you need so many trains?
12 minutes, ranging from troop trains.
Unless you're bringing cargoes that's going to help in future wars. Is that Hitler?
Lines in France to hospitals.
It doesn't do with the hat and the mustache.
Long,
you saw how bushy it was? It was bushy. Not bushy. Bushy.
Named after Admiral of the Fleet John Jellicoe, which carried coal.
John Jellicoe. That almost sound like Angelica.
In the Orkney Islands.
I don't even think about that girl from Rugrats. She's annoying.
During the entire course of the war, this endless flow of trains full of soldiers, horses, equipment,
right. 1328.
and other things would not go without incident. And unfortunately, 1 year into the war, in 1915, there would be an incident that would go down as the worst train wreck in British history.
Da da da! Okay, so we're in Her Majesty's country, which is pretty cool. Really? Over a century old, and this is the worst thing that happened in their history?
22nd, 1915.
That is kind of astonishing. I don't know what's been going on in their country because I don't live over there, but hey.
In this historic part of Scotland in the fields lay the Quintinshill signal box, which was a remote location sited to control two passing loops, one on each side of the double-track main line of the Caledonian Railway. Alexander station master at Gretna Station was responsible for the operation of the signal box.
Does everything have to be black and white?
Smoothly.
Add some color, even if you gotta fake it.
One signalman on a shift.
Get a kid and let me get like color and everything.
One morning shift and one.
It's so blurry.
The night shift changing with the morning one at 6 a.m. On this day of the disaster, George Meakin was the night signalman, while
Meatkin?
Tinsley was to work the early day shift. At this time of day, normal northbound traffic through the area included two overnight express trains from London to Glasgow and Edinburgh, respectively, which were due to depart Carlisle at 5:50 a.m. and 6:05 a.m. They were to be followed by a local train from Carlisle to Beddock, which was due to depart Carlisle at 6:10 a.m., but which normally departed at 6:17 a.m.
Too many numbers!
Trains ran late. The local service could not be held back to
14750!
because precedence.
That's the only number I've seen. He's saying all these other big fat numbers like nobody cares.
6:30 a.m. from other railroads. Also, any late running of the local train would cause knock-on delays to the Moffat and Glasgow and Edinburgh commuter train service.
This image is way better than the previous one.
Look at Therefore, in the event of one or both of the overnight trains running late, the local would be departing at its normal scheduled time of 6:10 a.m. and then would be shunted into one of the intermediate stations or signal boxes to allow the express trains to pass.
What is that thing? That
One of the
on that
locations
pole,
where this could take place was
like a net.
Quintinshill, where there were passing loops for both the up and
Quintinshill
down
signal
lanes.
box.
If the
Passing
northbound
loop.
loop, the down line, was
Passing loop.
occupied, then the northbound
Carlisle
train would be
and
shunted
Glasgow.
via a trailing crossover
I thought we were in
to the
Britain,
up
not Scotland.
southbound main line.
Or,
This method of
you know what? I
operation
don't remember much
was
of my history.
risky.
Are they like
It was
close to
allowed
each
by the
other?
rules and was not considered to
I
be
don't
a
remember.
dangerous maneuver, provided
No,
the proper precautions are
we were
taken.
never taught that.
In the 6 months before the
Not our
accident,
school
a
system.
6:17 a.m. local had been shunted at Quintinshill
That looked like a school bus
21
in the back. That
times.
yellow thing.
For those occasions, it was on the up main line. On May 22nd, the two express trains were running late, so the local, led by car D in class 460 number 907, would
More
have to be
numbers.
shunted into a siding to allow the express trains to pass.
I see the
In this
907.
case, it was Quintinshill. But there was a problem.
R. You see that R?
A northbound freight train was occupying the loop for the northbound track, and to make matters worse, an empty Jellicoe special coal train going back to Wales
P11.
was due in a few minutes, with a troop train led by 139 class 440 number 121.
All I see is 121. I don't know where you've seen these other numbers. I see CR 121.
Night shift signalman had to think of something and
And I see it. I think that's a
he
bird.
made the local stop on the northbound main track and instructed the local to clear the next set of points ahead, stop, then back up on the southbound main track to wait. He would then signal the coal train to use the empty southbound loop to wait for the southbound troop train, since express trains...
What are you talking about with these red lines?
Priority. The local train complied, backed onto the southbound main, and stopped at 6:33 a.m., with the coal train pulling into the southbound loop 4 minutes later. This was the moment the first seeds of disaster were planted. The first northbound express
planting the seeds of
passed
disaster.
by without incident.
Putting the dirt over them, watering them. It's gonna take a couple of days, or whenever this is about to happen.
The now parked local train he was traveling on and walked straight up to the signal box at Quintinshill to take the night shift.
Kirkpatrick and Associates.
Later have a little chatter and read the morning newspaper that the morning signalman had brought with him before the night shift signalman would head off.
I'm sorry, Quintinshill sounds like a janitor, a custodian, if you will.
And there was some discussion of the war.
That's what it sounded like the name of.
Shortly after that, because the local train had stood on the main line for over 3 minutes,
see something R
of British rail regulations,
and whatever that is.
The driver of the local sent fireman George Hutchinson to the signal box.
That circle under the guy.
55 states out of
Look at him just sticking out, waiting for the picture. Look like he about to get crashed on.
3 minutes in clear weather or immediately in rain, snow, or fog.
There's a number above the wagon to the left.
For any shunter riding on the train to the signal box.
Like we need more numbers in our trains, on our trains, around our trains, getting ready to be put on trains, taking our trains so new numbers can be put on those trains. And that's nonsense.
The crewman would then sign the train register to confirm this and report back to his train. Although he left at 6:46 a.m., he failed to fully perform the required duties.
You fool!
After the first northbound express flew,
I was 21. Good to see you again.
Trained Quintinshill to pass through. Signalman Tinsley immediately agreed, and 4 minutes later, he was offered and accepted the second northbound being led by two locomotives, number 140 of the Dunall Stair 4 class, and number 48 of the 43 class. Both
what about 49? What about 47?
7 a.m., Tinsley received the train entering section signal from Kirkpatrick for the troop train, and asked to have the troop train
up
proceed
main, down main, down passenger loop, up passenger loop, up main, down main. What are all these words? What are all these numbers? I'm so tired of numbers!
However, the men had totally the train that was still sitting on the main line.
Yeah, Kirkpatrick and Associates is back.
Headed down the main line.
Circles. Now we're playing football. We're doing replays.
Or 80 miles an hour. And at 6:49 a.m.
It turned into a W. It turned into a freshly squeezed W. We got an image of the crash.
The troop train collided head
Oh, it's
on with a
brown.
stationary local on the
That's
other
about
line.
time somebody added
30
color.
seconds later, the second northbound
Ooh,
express, trying to stop and avoid the derailed trains,
that looked like a
tripped
cover
over the
for. That looked
wreckage
like a
and derailed
an
at
arts
over
for a
80
movie.
kilometers an hour, or 50 miles an hour. The sound of crunching wood, screeching steel, and the screams of victims filled the air. The
I'm sure
derailed
that'll
passenger
arouse
trains
somebody.
also sent wreckage toward the stopped freight trains, causing the
Tender,
cars
tender,
beneath them
tender,
to
tender,
also
tender.
trip.
Engine, weak wreckage of good train. Of tender of true grade.
Wooden
Tender, tender,
coaches
tender, tender, tender.
telescoped into one another from the
Chicken
impact,
tenders,
and
tender loving
gas-powered
care.
interior lights ruptured their gas
Tenderoni.
tanks, setting the coaches on fire, spreading the flames even through the undamaged upright coaches. Some of the passengers that escaped the wreckage from the local and troop trains were also mowed down by the northbound express as it crashed into the wreckage. Local farmers that heard the crash and survivors quickly tried to help those still trapped in the burning wreckage, with some victims requiring amputation of limbs to free them. Rumor has it that some soldiers even shot those that were
And
burning
cut
alive to put them
pieces
out
of
of their
body off to get
terrible
them
misery.
loose.
A total of approximately 226 people died, and 246 were injured, most of them seriously. The overwhelming majority of fatalities were among the men in the Royal Scots, and the precise number was not established, as the roll list of the regiment was destroyed in the fire. Of the 500 soldiers of the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots on the troop train, only 58 men were present for roll call at 4 p.m. that afternoon, along with 7 officers. Amazingly, despite the double collision and fire, there were only a few casualties in the other 2 trains. On the local train, only 2 passengers died, 28-year-old Rachel Nimmo and her 1-year-old son Dixon. None of the survivors
Not
on the local
Dixon!
were injured. On the express train, only 7 passengers died, with a further 51 passengers and 3 crew members injured. Some of the bodies were never recovered, having been incinerated by the fire, and when the bodies of the men of the Royal Scots were returned to Leith on the 24th of May, they were buried together in a mass grave in Edinburgh's Rosebank Cemetery. Of the soldiers killed, 83 bodies were identified, 82 were recovered but unrecognizable, and 50 were missing altogether, probably incinerated in the wreckage. The soldiers were buried with full military honors. Among the coffins were 4 bodies which were unidentified and appeared to be the remains of children. One coffin was simply labeled as "Little Girl," unrecognizable, and the other 3 as 3 trunks, possibly children. As no children were reported missing, the railway company, the Caledonian Railway, moved the bodies to Glasgow for possible identification, but no one came forward to claim the identity of the bodies.
Isn't it really
Some think they
sad when
may have
it's
been
just to the
soldier
point where
bodies, badly shriveled
once they get
and reduced
incinerated,
by the burning.
nobody
The
can
4 were
recognize them
buried
and
in
nobody will come
Glasgow's
up.
Western
Like,
Necropolis on the
is nobody
26th of
even
May.
around to be like, where
Passengers
is my
aboard the troop
child?
train who were also killed were both from Carley and were also buried on May 26 by Stanwick Cemetery. As for the surviving soldiers, they were sent to Carley on the evening of the crash and sent back to Liverpool the next morning on another train. On arrival, they were medically examined, and all the enlisted men and 1 officer were declared unfit for service overseas and were returned to Edinburgh. Lieutenant Colonel W. Carmichael Peebles and 5 other officers were fit enough to sail from Liverpool for overseas service in France. It was reported in the Edinburgh Weekly that on their way from the port to the railway station, the survivors were mistaken for prisoners of war and pelted with rocks by some local children, as if they didn't have enough pain to deal with.
Seriously. Also,
The
you're grounded because you're throwing
investigation
rocks
revealed
in somebody's
several
vehicle.
glaring breaches in railroad regulations. For the 6 a.m. shift change, the signalman had developed an informal arrangement allowing whoever was working the early day shift to arrive for work almost half an hour late. This allowed the day shift
Sorry.
signalman to get up slightly later, and in the case of signalman Tinsley, who lived in Gretna, it enabled him to travel to work on the local train on days when it was to be shunted at Quintinshill. The signalman at Gretna Junction would let Tinsley know if this was to occur or not. To avoid this malpractice being detected by the company management, whichever signalman was working the night shift would record all train register entries after 6 a.m. on a piece of paper rather than in the register book itself. When the day shift man arrived, he would copy the entries from the paper into the train register in his own handwriting, making it appear that the shift change had occurred at the correct time. The changing of shifts was a safety critical moment where it was essential that the signalman taking over the box was fully aware of the position of trains and for all block signaling requirements to be properly completed and recorded. The need for Signalman Tinsley to copy out the missing train register entries as soon as he took over the signal box may have distracted him from his duties in relation to the handover of the box. Also, two crucial failures in block signaling procedure occurred.
I'm listening. I'm just
First, as soon as the train out of
stuff.
section bell code had been telegraphed to the Kirkpatrick signalman to advise that the empty coal train was out of the block and clear of the up main line at Quintinshill, the Quintinshill signalman should have followed up by sending the blocking back bell code to Kirkpatrick. This would advise the Kirkpatrick signalman that another train, the down local, was occupying the up main line inside the Quintinshill home signal. On receipt of the blocking back bell, the Kirkpatrick signalman would not have been allowed to offer another up train, in this case the troop train, to Quintinshill until he had received the obstruction removed bell from the Quintinshill signalman to confirm that the local was clear of the up line and out of the way. However, although the train out of section signal was belled to Kirkpatrick, the blocking back signal was never sent. Secondly, Tinsley should have placed a signal lever collar over the relevant signal lever, which would have reminded him not to clear his signals for the up line because of the local train occupying it. Other factors included the failure of Rule 55, where the local train fireman merely signed the train register using a pen which Tinsley, who was on the intent of filling the missing entries of the train register, handed over his shoulder without looking up and returning to his engine, without reminding the signaler of his train's position or checking that the signalman had placed a lever collar on the signal lever. Also, the guards of the other trains being in the signal box weren't supposed to be there. The mere fact that the signalman just totally forgot about the local sitting on the main track that the troop train was signaled through on was a recipe for disaster. In the end, the two signalmen and the fireman of the local were charged with culpable homicide. The fireman was found not guilty, but the two signalmen served
And child neglect. Arrested for child neglect.
released in December of
His children
1960,
died,
and
bruh.
were unbelievably
A 1-year-old died for sure.
Union Railway, as if nothing had happened. But they weren't rehired as signalmen, as Tinsley went to be a lamp man, and Meakin became a goods train guard. Some years later, he was made redundant from that job and set himself up as a coal merchant, trading from
Redundant?
Quintinshill siding right next to the scene of the crash site. In the Second World War, he worked in the Gretna munitions factory until he retired due to ill health. Tinsley died in 1967, and Meakin died in 1953. The locomotives of the troop train, as well as the local, were damaged beyond repair and scrapped, while the locomotives of the express train were returned to service after repairs. Both locomotives would continue their service with the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, and later British Rail, but unfortunately, by 1958, both locomotives were withdrawn and scrapped. However, many years later, in 2015, a BBC TV documentary called Britain's Deadliest Rail Disaster, Quintinshill, was first aired
I'm pretty
on the
sure
20th of
Quintinshill
May,
goes first.
2015. The video was a re-examination of the disaster in a modern-day rail inquiry. It argued that both the signalmen had been made scapegoats for the crash, and there may have been some conspiracy to cover up the fact that the
Fires are dumb. They have
and the
brains.
government, who ran the railway during the war, were actually responsible instead. They even said that the railway's attitude toward their own rules was rather tardy, stating that they barely even followed their own rules, mainly letting
Screw the rules. I have money.
signalmen for shift changes slide under the watchful eyes of managers. They even pointed out the Caledonian Railway's desire to keep peacetime service running to make more money, even though the network was experiencing tons of extra wartime traffic, and they didn't realize that this could put added stress on the signalmen. It also argued that the local train would not have sat on the main line in the first place if the passing loops had not been used as storage sidings to store the two freight trains. It finally also sought to take some blame away from Tinsley because he may have been suffering a form of epilepsy, which affected his short-term memory, which they argued would have explained why he may have simply forgot of the waiting local train. Whether you blame the Caledonian Railway or the signalmen, we can all agree that this terrible tragedy during the First World War was just as tragic as the war itself.
You can say that. Okay. Oh man, this is probably one of his longest videos. Longest one I've seen so far. Yeah, it was pretty. That's 105 years ago. Like, still didn't recognize anybody and stuff. All right. I'll see y'all later. Let me know what other videos you want me to look at.